I am Amy Cass, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation about Veterans Day, the meaning of Veterans Day, in one of a series of conversations about American holidays, all of which will be based on selections taken from a new anthology entitled What So Proudly We Hail, The American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song. Since Veterans Day is rather complicated, I thought we would begin by having a discussion of what the history of that was, the history of Veterans Day, as well as what it currently means. And then we'll dive into a discussion of one of the selections, which I will introduce then. Okay?
Yeah,
Leon, would you help us?
Yeah, Veterans Day, in its original incarnation, is known as Armistice Day. It was instituted to celebrate the ceasefire, which took place at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, a ceasefire between the Allies and Germany that was the end of the fighting of the Great War, the First World War, the war thought to be the war to end all wars. A year later, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed the first Armistice Day to honor the services of the troops, but also to celebrate the opportunity that victory provided for the United States to play its proper role in securing peace and justice in the international community of nations. Congress eventually, actually ironically, almost on the eve of the Second World War, 1938, proclaimed, by an act of Congress, proclaimed Armistice Day to be a national legal holiday. But after the Second World War and after the Korean War, the so-called Good Wars, with some encouragement by veterans groups, Congress altered the law to rename the holiday Veterans Day in honor of the veterans of all of America's wars, to celebrate their patriotism, their service to their country, and to the common good. And so it has remained since.
A couple of thoughts about Veterans Day. First is, this strikes me as the only American civic holiday which is connected with Europe. We're not the only ones who celebrate that day. In fact, if you see soldiers from Great Britain or Canada or Australia around now, you'll see that they're wearing red poppies, which is very common in Great Britain and Commonwealth states. So there's a European connection which didn't exist before. And the original meaning is obviously tied to the First World War. The other thing, which I think is worth thinking about, so World War I, World War II, Korea, all wars fought by conscripts. Veterans Day only comes in celebrating wars which were entirely fought by conscripts, which is not true of our previous wars. Most of the Union Army were volunteers, not all of them. And going back, these are wars that have been fought by volunteers. So I think in its original meaning, a lot of what Veterans Day was about was not a tiny minority of volunteers. It was about a great mass of conscripts who had been called up, did their duty, and came back.
It's true that those wars were wars fought largely by conscripts, and it was a citizen rather than a professional volunteer army. But that might mean that it's even more important for us today to honor Veterans Day, precisely because the larger population has much less contact with the people who serve. In other words, we have a duty to honor which we are likely to forget, whereas the people who have fought don't forget.
Well, I think it's important to think about it for sure. I think it's very important to keep clear in our minds the distinction between the citizen soldier and the professional. And I think their motivations are different. I think the nature of the sacrifice is different. And I don't think we should blur those over. The other thing is, it's true, it's a minority. It's not that tiny a minority. I mean, we have now had probably well over 1 million Americans serve in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a tiny minority of the overall population of the United States, but it's a lot. In some parts of the country, it's a small minority. In the parts that we live in, or that I was born in, it's probably a tiny minority. I think you go to other parts of the country, you would find, much more in the way of connections with people who one way or another have served. And I at this juncture in our history, I don't think people are inclined to forget. In fact, one of the things that's quite extraordinary I think just looking at it as an historian, is the extent to which we really do honor veterans an enormous amount. The veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars have gotten treated remarkably well by the American public.
I would say that the meaning of what it means to be a veteran today has changed dramatically. I mean, and one of it is the sort of point you brought up of, well, the move from a draftee military to a professional military. There's two other points here that I think tend to get overlooked. Particularly with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have many more civilians running around doing combat-like duties. I mean, I'm an intelligence officer by trade. The amount of interaction I had with people not wearing uniforms in combat, living on the other side of my compound, is really pretty remarkable. And the same is true for, the State Department reps who are running around doing development missions and so on. And then moreover, I was teaching to my undergrads this past week World War I, which is actually very apropos. And, to try to get them to place the two in context, you think about what day one of the Battle of the Somme was like. So 60,000 British casualties, day one, July 1, 1916. 20,000 of those, well, actually a little less, killed in action. That's about 3 times the number of casualties that we've suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan for the entire 10 years. I mean, it's a level of carnage that, as much as I like to sort of beat my chest, oh, I'm a veteran, it's an order of magnitude different than what I experienced, and I think most veterans today experienced.
Let's draw a circle around this conversation for a moment, gentlemen, and we'll return to it at the end, okay? It's a very nice way to move into the speech that we want to discuss. It's a speech by Lieutenant General John F. Kelly of the United States Marine Corps. It was given on Veterans Day a year ago to the Semper Society in St. Louis. And he has lots of things to tell us about what it means to be a veteran, what it means to fight, what's the difference between the few and the many. So perhaps we could start by just summarizing the speech. Elliot, if you would do that, that would be
Sure.
very helpful.
Well, I should say just 1 or 2 things by way of introduction, which is I know General Kelly, and he's quite a wonderful leader. The second thing one has to say is that he gives this speech 4 days after his own son, who was a Marine, is killed in combat. The speech is given to the Semper Fi Society. I'm not quite sure what the Semper Fi Society is. My guess is it's a Marine Veterans Association.
It's a society that is meant to support Marines and their families.
Right. So my guess is this is probably a combination of Marine veterans and family of Marines, but it's within the Marine family. I think that's quite important. And what he does is he talks about 9/11. And he describes the general reaction to 9/11 of shock and horror, and then he talks about people hugging their children and people crying. Then he says there was, however, a small segment of America that made very different choices that day. So he's drawing a very large distinction between the great mass of the American people and a smaller group, and that smaller group is first he says firefighters and police. But then it's the armed forces and above all the Marines. And really most of the speech is about the Marines. There are repeatedly these invidious distinctions, I would say, drawn between people who serve and people who don't. The people who serve you can never thank enough. There's a kind of dismissive remark about people with put plastic flags in the windows of their cars. And it concludes with a very powerful description of two Marines who win the Navy Cross, which was a very high decoration for heroism, who opened fire on this was an incident in Iraq, opened fire on a truck bomb coming into a compound, and they themselves are killed in the blast, but they, in the sort of 5 seconds they had to react, they killed the driver so that it didn't get all the way into the compound. And he describes in quite a chilling way, looking at the footage of some security cameras which captured that. So he kind of imagines what it's like to live the last 5 seconds of their lives. As you can probably guess, and I say this with a great deal of diffidence, having enormous respect for him, and obviously not having lost a son, but having thought about losing a son, it's a speech that troubles me. And I have to say I don't entirely mean that in the positive sense of being troubled.
It's given by a Marine General Officer to the Semper Fi Society. So I think the correct way of interpreting the speech is not, you shouldn't picture this as, some grand statement on civil-military relations between, the military and the rest, and you shouldn't interpret this as some sort of grand sociological study of, like, why men fight. I think this is it's insightful and for how the Marines want to see themselves, how this sort of small subset of Americans, want to cast their own image, if nothing else. And in that sense, I think it's quite useful. Whether or not the...
Let me see if I understand you correctly. You want to say it's that small subset, the Marines, the way the Marines see themselves.
The Marines see themselves.
And you would distinguish that from the way people in the Army see themselves.
Yes.
Or people in the Navy see themselves.
Look, I think the Marines are small, insular. I mean, the Corps is the Corps is the Corps, right? They believe it's an extraordinarily strong brand image. It's a much stronger brand image than the Army is. You can be part of, the intelligence corps. You can be part of the light infantry community. You can be part of the heavy army, or you can be part of the special operations community. Each of those have sort of various tribes in them. The Marines and Marine behavior is you are first and foremost a Marine. And this is a very strong, and I think you see this very strong branding image come out in the speech. And I think this also then interjects of like how he's casting how Marines want to view themselves.
I mean, let's grant that this is an attempt to boost the spirits, in fact, of the Marines and their families, and to encourage them to think the best of the work and the sacrifice. Don't you think that there is some truth in the kind of distinction that's being drawn between the people who are warriors and who fight, and the rest of us who not only don't, but have no idea of what it's like? And many of us, I know you and I know a few other people. I didn't know a soul who was in Vietnam.
No, I think that's true. I just don't think the distinction is nearly as clear-cut as I think comes out in the speech. It's not between Marines and civilians. It's not between necessarily military and civilians. I think there's a distinction between people who serve overseas, and I include in that, my friends over in, down the street in Virginia or in Foggy Bottom, who are also over there, who also risked their neck, who also did, who also as much of a veteran as I am, and people who, spend...
If I could pitch in, I also think it's much less relevant than I think both of you think, for a number of reasons. It is, and again, I have admiration for him and a great deal of sympathy for him. There are a number of things. Let me tell you some of the things that are troubling about it. In all that description of 9/11 and the description of heroic reactions, and this ties into what Rafi said about the State Department people, there's one group of people who are not mentioned. The civilians on Flight 93 who stormed the cockpit. They're not mentioned. And they were every bit as heroic as any of those firefighters or any of those cops or any of the Marines or any of the soldiers or any of the diplomats. And I think there's something very worrisome if we think that courage is a quality that's reserved for certainly one segment of the military or the military overall. I would also say, and I understand this is an inspirational speech in a certain setting, so I'm not really going to blame him for it. But when you talk about the sons and daughters who serve are men and women of character, some are, some aren't. I've heard a Marine four-star say, you know who we like to recruit? Gang members. And he was partly speaking for effect. But the truth is, the American military is a mirror of this society. And one of the dangers of being as separate from the military, as you just indicated you are, is you forget. You get some truly noble characters, and you get some dirtballs. And you get some people who are intensely admirable and some people who are not admirable. And you forget another thing, which is that incredibly powerful description at the end. That's not what most soldiers do. Most soldiers are fixing tanks or building roads or working at a desk. The number actually engaged in actual combat turns out to be pretty limited. And I think in a certain way, what ends up undervaluing are the qualities of persistence and putting up with stuff and pressing on through not very exciting 7-day weeks and 16-hour days, which is what Rafi did for over 2 years, and doing your duty. That's actually, to my mind, that's the meaning of Veterans Day, and those are the virtues to celebrate.
Wait a second. Are you suggesting that the reason to celebrate Veterans Day is to celebrate this boring life that so many people are willing to volunteer to commit themselves to?
In part, yes.
I think this goes back to the distinction between Memorial Day and Veterans Day. Memorial Day is about the Lance Corporal Yales, who give the ultimate sacrifice while guarding the gates of the FOB with the suicide bomber. That's Memorial Day. Veterans Day is the equally heroic, not equally heroic, the equally important. It's not necessarily as heroic. I use that term loosely. Sacrifice, which is the less glorious part. It's the drudgery of warfare.
But the drudgery of warfare is not something that most of the population, however much it's drudgery, and even if it's only a small part of combat that you see, and the rest of it is doing very menial jobs or boring jobs, there's less than 1% of the population that volunteers, and doesn't
but that's the point. Well, this is why we have Veterans Day, right? Which is, the fact is the drudgery is distinct.
There's an excerpt which I wish you had included in this, or that at least you'd take a look at, and that's Lincoln's meditation on the draft. Late in the Civil War, the Union's running out of army. They're running out of soldiers, and it has to contemplate a draft, which they really didn't want to do. And Lincoln writes this note, which is, as was typical with Lincoln, he's sort of working out his arguments. And he talks about the reason why do people volunteer to serve? And he says patriotism, desire for adventure, lack of employment, curiosity. And Lincoln, with his enormous human wisdom, understands there's a range of motivations for why people enlist. And I think this is one of the sad consequences of moving away from conscription, is we make it very easy to sentimentalize soldiers.
This isn't a question of sentimentalizing. It's a question of recognizing the difference between that kind of service and being a doctor, a teacher, a nurse, or social worker at home. Let's put it this way, whatever the deepest motives are, there's a difference between the people who run from danger and the people who walk toward danger. And you could say that of the firefighters and the policemen. There are good apples and bad apples amongst them. And nevertheless, when duty calls, most of them do what they're supposed to do. Let me finish. Yes, and the Army or the Navy or the Marines take that raw material with its mixed motives and they shape them up. I mean, they form them. It's not clear whether whether Yale and Herder were by nature superior men or had something which their subsequent training enabled them to do that almost none of the rest of us could do, or very few of us could do. But look, the people who enter the service enter with the intent not to sit behind a desk, but to be part of the fighting force.
I mean, but the point is, most infantrymen will go through years in Iraq or in Afghanistan without having fired their weapon. This is certainly true of Iraq. It may not be true of Afghanistan because it's a little bit more.
So what?
But the point is if you're saying what separates State Department folk from soldiers is the simple fact that soldiers are asked to kill people and State Department aren't, most soldiers don't do that.
Oh, but it's
and most soldiers, moreover, aren't infantrymen, and they aren't supposed to be doing that. They can do that in a pinch, but that's not what they mostly do.
I will admit that I am sentimental about the veterans, about the people who volunteer to serve our country and who actually go and put their life on the line. But holding that aside, and holding aside also the motives for which people go, I think that's probably interesting, but I don't think it's particularly relevant. They go. I want to ask you this question pointedly. You're an undergraduate at Harvard. Mm-hmm. Would you say that you were different from the rest of the people that you went to school with, or not? Very few of your fellow classmen, of your colleagues, went into the Army, yep. Went into service. There was no ROTC. That's probably part of the reason, but not the entire reason. Yep. So the question is there really a difference between those who volunteer to go into the Army and those who don't, regardless of the work that they do?
Sure there is. No, then that way I'll say.
And how would you characterize that difference?
How would I characterize this? I mean, look, here's where I step back from saying that everyone's the same. I think there is a difference between people who make a conscious effort to serve and people who decide to spend, as many of my classmates did, went on to Wall Street and lived a very nice life in downtown Manhattan. Is there much of a difference between my choice to serve and then some of my compatriots who ended up CIA or ended up in the State Department or in some of the aid communities, going to equally nasty parts of the world, equally public-spirited, equally accepting of danger? I mean, goodness knows, I think I was probably safer in Baghdad than, had I been assigned to the consul in Peshawar.
Would you agree with that?
When you go into the military, and this is why I bring up Flight 93, or why I bring up some of the State Department people that I knew who exposed themselves to terrific danger and kind of quietly went back in. And it's actually harder if you're not carrying a weapon. It's not easier because you can't shoot back. You're not allowed to shoot back, actually. You're not allowed to carry a weapon. The military is terrific at conditioning people and at developing courage. I mean, I didn't have Rafi's experience. I was in the reserves, though. But I just remember all the different things, whether it's rappelling and all the stuff that they do that kind of conditions you to be brave. Jumping out of an airplane. Rafi had to jump out of an airplane a number of times. The reason for that is not because he's going to be jumping out of an airplane in all likelihood for any combat reason. It's to develop courage. The military is great at that. The military is great at conditioning you to the different drills that you need to do so that you don't have to think a lot about it in a really difficult situations, that your kind of autonomous system kind of takes over and you behave. I find myself, I mean, not on Veterans Day, and I very much believe, Veterans Day should be commemorated and you should honor service, understanding that it is service. But the idea that there is a small minority of brave, patriotic people and the rest of us are something inferior, I utterly reject. And the evidence is that United 93. A randomly selected bunch of citizens who had no preparation and who end up storming that cockpit.
No one is saying that courage is the province only of the military. We're talking about the culture as a whole and at large. And there's a big difference between finding it in yourself as, say, a civilian to rush into a burning building, which happens in your path, to rescue somebody who's calling out. And we admire those kinds of sporadic acts of courage and self-sacrifice. From an occupation, a calling, a way of life in which that is its essence. That's what it's defined to be. And the point again is, look, there are people who go to dangerous places. There are people who go to dangerous places and subject themselves to danger. There are American businessmen who go to parts of the world where they're unwelcome. But it's a difference in kind if you are going charged by your fellow countrymen, your government, to engage in the activity, to protect us, protect our way of life, to kill our enemies and the people who are trying to destroy it. That's a very different vocation.
Well, like I said, I'm colored by 2 years in the State Department, seeing some very brave diplomats go back and back again to be targets. But look, first, I think you cannot read this speech as anything other than saying there are two different kinds of people out here. To use a phrase that's now current, there's 1% and a 99%. And the implicit argument here is the 1% is by nature morally superior to the other 99%, and I reject that.
Let me ask a slightly different question. This is another question about the relation between those who serve in the military and those who don't. But the question is, do we really honor them if we don't in fact honor the cause for which they're fighting?
Yes, because sometimes the cause will be one with which people disagree. But you can honor soldiers, and I think that's one of the good things in the country. We have honored service without, the people have honored soldiers while deploring, say, the war in Iraq.
It seems to me, Elliot, although it's a volunteer army, we and our representatives have given them their mission and sent them where they are. They're not simply flying on their own. And you can dissent in a way from the war, and people have dissented from lots of wars. But it seems to me it's patronizing, and even to some degree, it's a form of dishonor not to try to see the service through the eyes of the people who serve. And while perhaps reserving judgment about the war, not imagining yourself as honoring them properly when you say, we support the troops, bring them home. We're for the troops. That's a way of making ourselves feel good.
I think it would be very dangerous to American, and by the way, I was somebody who was in favor of the Iraq War. At the end of the Bush administration, I had some responsibility for helping to conduct it, and I have a son who went off and served in 2 combat tours. I would be horrified if people felt inhibited from opposing that war because it was cast as in some ways being disloyal to troops. So I wouldn't even accept your term reserving judgment. I think full-throated opposition is fine. And none of that prevents you from honoring service. And I think one should honor the service of veterans. But that should have nothing to do with what position you take on any conflict, because these are professionals. We will be sending them to fight ambiguous wars for ambiguous causes. This is not the Civil War. This is not World War II. Those are not the kinds of wars we're going to fight. And there has to be civic space for people to disagree, and disagree very forcefully about that, while saying that's completely apart from our regard for the people who actually go out and do it.
I'm not making an argument against people who oppose the war or express those opinions loudly. There's a certain way of patronizing the soldiers, really patronizing the soldiers, if you treat them as if they are other than they are, namely as people who thoughtlessly went out and did the bidding of people who bore no risk themselves. And it seems to me you have to at least understand they've chosen this knowing what the risks are, and one has to honor not only that they served, but honor their understanding of what they were doing when they served.
I've spent my whole life among soldiers. I think different soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines understand their service very differently. They are individuals. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it always sets my teeth on edge, but for a different reason when people talk about we got to bring the troops home. That's the rhetoric of a conscript military, and I can understand that actually in the context of the Vietnam War, because those kids got drafted. They didn't really get much of a choice unless they made an honorable choice not to dodge the draft. But they got drafted and sent over there, so bring the boys home can make sense. When it's a bunch of professionals who have volunteered for this, it makes no sense to talk about we've got to bring the troops home. The question is this war worth fighting? Is it winnable? Is it worth sacrificing human beings for? Those are all legitimate questions. But and I think this is probably a pretty profound disagreement. I don't think we suffer from a deficit of honoring veterans. I really don't.
Yeah, well, I think, yes, you should have Veterans Day. I mean, that's not I think that's a non-starter of a question. But I think you need to interpret it in the correct format. And I think you need to think about a little bit, redefine what we mean by veteran in today's day and age. I would make this about people who serve in war zones and people who serve the United States government in war zones A.
So the only veterans we should celebrate or honor on Veterans Day are those who served in war zones.
Well, I mean, veteran, you could talk about veteran as in someone who served in the military and veteran who served in combat. I think people who serve in combat are actually, from my own personal view, I place people who serve in combat on a different level. I mean, it's a different level of sacrifice. I also think this should not be a day simply about people who, died in combat or were killed in combat. That's what we have Memorial Day for. And I think to make Memorial Day meaningful, which is the flip side of this, that's where we need to take some special time for those people who died in combat. Veterans Day should be thought of, not in sort of grand glorification terms. It should be understood for what wars are today and what wars has been in the past and how those sort of change. And to appreciate war for what it is and for the small sacrifices, not the big ones. It's the fact that, my soldier can't, missed how many ever birthdays of his only kid or, missed his kid learning to walk or talk. Those are the sacrifices you should be honoring on Veterans Day. And it's the small stuff, not necessarily the grand marks of heroism. That's sort of the easy part.
Well, I'm moved, Rafi, by the voice of young and recent experience. It seems to me not the way I would natively regard it. You might persuade me to regard it this way. I go down to the World War II Memorial. It's not the greatest memorial. No. There are things about it I don't like. But at least for the time being, there's something glorious about it. It is an enclosed space surrounded by in a way, the monuments by states for some crazy reason. But it's an enclosed space of freedom where right now, at least for a while longer, you encounter veterans from the Second War. And total strangers walk up to them, and they don't just in a perfunctory way thank them for their service. That was clearly a war, and it was the war that defined my consciousness. That's a war which made the whole world of difference. And our way of life, the way of life of Europe, the way of life of the whole world was in the balance. And the United States, and anybody who fought in that war, I take my hat off to them permanently. no matter what they do with the rest of their life. There are people who work in government or in surgery and other sorts of things that also miss out lots of things, maybe not to the same extent. But it does seem to me that one has to continue to esteem the purpose and the unique purpose of the armed forces. This is not simply putting them on a pedestal. We should not only honor Veterans Day in a very special way for the military aspect of this, as well as for the personal sacrifices, but also there's a kind of question as how do you honor the service, and not just on this day. And there's this wonderful thing at the end of Saving Private Ryan, where the injunction is, earn this, earn this.
Right, and I think that's absolutely. I mean, actually, I think we've come to, after kind of a little bit of give and take, I think two very interesting places. One is I think you've highlighted the question, which is Veterans Day about today's veterans, or is it about all veterans, including the citizen soldiers of the past, who are a very different type than today's veterans? And my own view is it should be a more sweeping kind of thing. When you think about all the people who, in a variety of contexts and different ways, ended up serving. But in terms of sort of going forward, what should an average citizen do? And I don't want to go back too much to the speech, but and it is a speech to Marines. But the only thing that's left for people who are civilians is just to feel rotten. That's all. I mean, you're going to feel rotten because I'm not a Marine. That's not adequate. But what is right, I think, is to take that last line from Saving Private Ryan, and having been cognizant of the sacrifices that all kinds of people made. Okay, so how am I going to lead my life? What does it mean to be a citizen? Those things. What does it mean to be a citizen of this country, which is what it is because a lot of people fought for it? I think that is a very positive way of using and of celebrating is the right word, Veterans Day. So we agree.
Well, I have to stick up for General Kelly at this point. There's inspiration from this sacrifice. It's not just feel rotten. He's not saying
it's inspiration for Marines.
It's
not.
I'm not a Marine. I'm not a Marine. There was something absolutely inspiring about this account of these young men. And it doesn't make me feel rotten. It makes me feel that I ought to work harder to deserve the sacrifice that they made.
You can't imagine yourself being a Marine at this point, right?
I'm a little creaky for that.
Yeah, well, so am I. So am I.
Look, I'm far from being a Marine, but I was very moved by that speech too.
I was very moved. I didn't say it's not a moving speech. It's a very moving speech.
Okay, but it seems to me if you really are willing to agree with Leon about what the end of Saving Private Ryan means, that it has something to do with the way you live your life. And the way you live your life well, because remember what happened there. Remember the sacrifices these men made. Remember that they risked their lives for your safety, for your freedom, for your way of life, and that seems to be precisely what General Kelly is arguing.
No, we're just going to have to disagree. That's not what's in the speech. I'm sorry, you read the speech. That's not what's in it.
He says, point blank.
I mean,
we owe them something.
That's saying we owe them. It's not saying that what you should take away from this is how you should live your life. It is what you owe them you can never repay, and you should just know that you can never repay it because you like to put a plastic, and you think that putting a plastic flag in your window is enough, and it's not enough, and there's nothing that's enough. And all that leaves you to do is just say, I'm going to go home and feel rotten.
I think you're reading too much into this. This is a speech by a Marine general officer to Marines. It's about Marines. I've heard way too many general officer speeches to come away particularly wrapped around the axle one way or the other. No, I mean, it's quite true.
That's a veteran talking.
Look, non-general.
No, this is a company grade, the somewhat, skewed company grade officer talking about, senior leadership. But look, this is it means to its audience.
Right.
To its audience, it means something, which is to the Marines. It is take inspiration from it. Had it been given to a general audience, I think you can interpret it as the on this one. I don't think the two are necessarily mutually diametrically opposed to each other.
It's a big question if the important issue is finally how we're going to live our lives. And the veterans serve as a way of reminding us to think seriously about that question.
We agree.
I know we agree, but we don't agree with my next move. We're thinking seriously about how we're going to live our lives precisely because they gave their lives for something so that we could live.
That's Memorial Day.
Well, it's true. The Memorial Day is about the fallen. But I agree with Rafi that one doesn't want to blur the differences between these holidays. But not only the fallen, but those who survived. Many of the difference between them might have been a matter of accident and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were engaged in the common activity, the meaning of which was to protect and to serve us in our way of life. And the nation is always in the debt of those people. And to honor them, you have to honor them above and beyond how you compensate them, whether in terms of money or other sorts of things.
So what do you want us to do? I mean, we say, thank you for your service. Okay, I've done that.
I mean,
what beyond that are we supposed to do?
Well, I mean, partly it's to pause and try to think very hard about what is our relation to them. I mean, thank you for your service is easy off the tip of the tongue. But to think hard about what our veterans of all of our wars have in fact done to make possible the way of life that we have, which in fact we haven't simply earned. There is a certain kind of grace that is here, and we should have a kind of really deep gratitude and a certain determination, not just on Veterans Day, that they shall not have sacrificed or served for naught.
And I think a very good way to begin to think about some of these issues is to begin where Rafi suggested. Think about the stories that lots of people who come home have to tell, the kinds of small things that they did, the small sacrifices that they made, the things that they've missed, and the things that you are blessed enough to have.